So, ladies and gents, if I could ask you to take your seats for the final lecture. One more heave, as they say. Just waiting for my signal from the back. So, the most obvious problem, I think, as one of the questions indicated at the end of the last lecture, the most obvious problem of our secular anti-Nazi values is that by swapping out a Christian-based value system for this new one, by centering our ethics around Hitler rather than around Jesus, we've replaced a positive exemplar with a negative one. Now, I'm perfectly happy with the basic moral intuition at work here. If you are going to choose one human being to stand as an exemplar for evil, then I defy you to come up with a better one. My problem isn't with the choice of candidate, but with the whole business of using an exemplar of evil to set our moral compasses. The result is that we now know what we hate, but we don't know what we love. Or rather, the things that we do love, such as human rights and liberty, are quite deliberately vacant categories. Their whole point is that they are undefined spaces in which individuals and communities can find what they love and pursue it, which of course people do, and that is a fine thing as far as it goes. But while in the age of Hannah Arendt, our culture has developed quite a deep understanding of evil, although there are problems there too that I'm going to come back to, we have a pretty impoverished understanding of what philosophers used to call the good. That definite article suggesting a single good feels not just old-fashioned, but almost imperialistic in our current moment, in which what animates us is often the concern that one person's good will not be another's. Now, the obvious thing for me to do here would be to launch into an extended gripe about consumerism and how we've come to think of flourishing not just in grimly utilitarian but reductively economic terms. But I'm going to try to resist that temptation, mostly. Partly on the grounds that I see the resurgence of identity politics of various kinds, nationalism of course included, as a revolt against merely economic concepts of flourishing, in which people are primarily consumers and producers. And to that extent at least, I see it almost as a welcome development. And in any case, the desire for wealth and physical prosperity really is a pretty universal feature of human societies, and these things have a perfectly legitimate place in the hierarchy of desires. The trouble is that we've lacked much sense in modernity, especially in the post-Cold War era, of what to put on top of them in that hierarchy. Yes, we should have rights, but what should we do with them? Now, let me be clear, I am no fan of utopian socio-political visions which have a way of racking up colossal human suffering while somehow never actually being achieved. But our modern alternative of a society whose collective hopes and ambitions are so wretchedly impoverished, some practical incremental improvements and, really, what else? I don't think it's sufficient to offer that as the only alternative. The emergence of tear the house down politics on the left and the right is a sign of that inadequacy. For much of my life, it seemed that in electoral politics, fear trumped hope. Voters could usually be persuaded to take the cautious option, to stick with what they had, however flawed, rather than taking a risky leap into the unknown. Plainly, for a decade or more, for a significant and often decisive group of voters, that calculus of risk has shifted. People no longer keep hold of nurse for fear, because really, how much worse could it be? And the response of those of us still within the old value frames to those sorts of challenges have tended to be pitifully defensive. Not just because the response tends to be, again, you can't say that, but also because the best the old establishments and their political parties seem to be able to do is to resist various malign developments rather than look for anything that's actually hopeful. The message is that the world that is as good as it gets. And it turns out that for many people that's not quite good enough. If the only positive offer that our anti-Nazi values have to make to the world is no genocide and incrementally increased rations of gruel, then we can't be surprised if much of the world decides it wants more. Meanwhile, knowing what we hate and defining our morals by the process of hatred has costs all of its own. Now, as we were saying, there's nothing new about morality expressing itself chiefly through denunciation and opposition. But I do think this has sharpened in our own times and that our public discourse has become increasingly shrill. I was mentioning George Orwell earlier. One of his less remembered but more queasily accurate prophecies in 1984 is the regular ritual of the 2-minute hate. Of course, he did get a crucial detail wrong. He, of course, meant the 140-character hate. But while it's conventional to blame social media for this phenomenon, I think this is like blaming the printing press for the Protestant Reformation or blaming railways for the First World War. It's sort of facile technological determinism that ducks the real issues. These are technologies that certainly help to catalyze and accelerate deeper processes, but the processes themselves are not dependent on them. Twitter doesn't do this to societies. Certain societies use Twitter to do this to themselves, and if we didn't have Twitter, we would find another way. And as Orwell also recognized, hatred of this kind is of necessity dynamic and self-cannibalizing. As we say nowadays, haters are going to hate. And since we're all haters now, we have to keep searching for new prey, new people to whom the Nazi label can be affixed. Hence our purity spirals, this process in which distinctions are drawn and virtue is signaled by turning on people who were previously accepted or admired or simply neutral. And the incentives in this are to strike first before the same process is turned on you. And I mean, typically this happens when a new orthodoxy suddenly hardens and its application is then declared retrospectively. And very often the principal targets are those who had once been figureheads. Heroes are turned to villains with the head-spinning speed that Robespierre or Trotsky would have recognized. Churchill was not by any means the only racist of his era, but it's the fact that he's up there on the pedestals that makes it so necessary to turn on him and to single him out. I was talking last week about the other myth makers of our post-Nazi era, the authors and filmmakers who've constructed idealized and timeless and fictionalized expressions of these new values. And now maybe because as creators of fictions, they're directly responsible for every aspect of the worlds that they create, they are unusually liable to be turned on. Poor old Tolkien has had quite a hard time of it. He was ferociously anti-Nazi, but the particular flavor of his anti-Nazism has not aged very well. There's a well-known letter that he wrote in 1938, replying to a German publisher who was proposing to bring out a German edition of The Hobbit. It had been published in English the previous year. So the German publisher asked Tolkien, as a formality, whether he was of Aryan descent. Now, Tolkien could not resist having a little bit of fun with this and pointing out in reply that the term Aryan was essentially meaningless and, if anything, referred to people from South India. But, of course, he knew that he was actually being asked if he was Jewish. And so when he came to the point, he said, "I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people." Which is splendidly defiant in its own way, but that kind of racial essentialism still feels a bit queasy nowadays. And there's a similar racial essentialism right through his myth, in which these fair-skinned quasi-Nordic peoples are the heroes, and the dark-skinned Southrons are bestial hordes, and orcs are beyond redemption and fit for nothing but slaughter. There is considerable affection for Tolkien nowadays on some parts of the far right. And as for J.K. Rowling, well, I'm not going to get drawn into the knife fight between one version of transgender rights and one version of feminism into which she's thrown herself, except to say that this is a dispute within the envelope of anti-Nazi values. And also that there's something intrinsically sad about the whole affair. A couple of years ago, I interviewed a delightful young American trans activist who for a time worked for the Harry Potter Alliance. This is an outfit formed in 2005 specifically to encourage Harry Potter fans to translate the moral message of her books into the real world. This became one of their slogans. Really, when I say that these values are taking the place of Christianity, I'm not making it up. So, the activist I interviewed, when he was 25 and working for this outfit, he came out as transgender. And he said that the values of the Harry Potter books and the community around them had eased that process for him. The books, he said, had taught him about being yourself, loving those who are different from you, and sticking up for the underdog. Now, call me a softie, but I think that's rather wonderful in its own way. And yet, Rowling herself hasn't taken quite the same line. And while my young man was very careful not to be drawn into criticizing her, it's all too well known that other Potter enthusiasts have been less restrained, and that she's been met with responses ranging from ostracization to the inevitable barrage of foul threats. Revolutions eat their children, and this one is doing so by moving towards an ethic which is inclusive of everything except dissent. Simply as a practical matter, it's not a good way to recruit new enthusiasts. One phrase which I keep being struck by in the arguments over these issues is the phrase, "my human rights are not up for debate," or variants on it. You'll often find it being used by LGBTQ advocates, but certainly not exclusively so. Now, given how central human rights are to our post-Nazi ethical framing, I think this is a really interesting gambit. And it's worth looking at to notice what's going on here. I think this is a statement that needs to be read on, well, at least 3 different levels. One at which it's self-evidently correct, one at which it's self-evidently nonsense, and the third at which there is a deeper truth to it. On the first, it's self-evidently correct in that it's insulting or worse for some people, and that would typically be straight, white, middle-class, cisgender men, such as myself, for people like me to debate whether people who are different from themselves share in their own rights, and to expect those people to participate in the debate on the same terms. Because to do that is to sit in a place of security, asking people to discuss dispassionately whether they deserve to have the same privileges. It is like the proverbial hen and pig discussing the rights and wrongs of eating bacon and eggs. One of them has rather more at stake in the debate than the other. But the same gambit, "my human rights aren't up for debate," is also obviously wrong, because plainly all our human rights are and must be up for debate. We disagree with each other about what our human rights are. The various declarations and bills of rights vary from one another. Even if we can agree the basic list, rights conflict with each other, and those conflicts have to be resolved. The reason that human rights law is a complex and contested area is that human rights must be debated. The only alternatives to that are fighting about them or simply submitting to one person's view of them. But at a deeper level still, I think, the claim that human rights aren't up for debate takes us back to Jefferson's claim that human rights are self-evident. At the most fundamental, the subject can't be debated, because there's no basis on which to do so. Rights are, in the end, asserted, and you either agree with the assertion or you don't. Actual debate, in the sense of constructive, good faith discussion between people of different viewpoints in honest pursuit of agreement, that is formidably difficult in this area. It's increasingly hard to find shared ground on which such debates can be held, and therefore it quickly turns into mutual mockery or willful and malicious misunderstanding. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. I imagine many of us have found ourselves caught in conversations of this kind. It's inevitable. It's where our increasingly brittle system of values leads us. One central feature of this brittleness, one of the problems that I think is built into a value system defined by evil rather than by goodness, is a lack of space for forgiveness and for redemption. Indeed, often those concepts are seen as suspicious, and with good reason. All too often they can be tools used by the powerful to create impunity, demanding forgiveness from those who instead deserve justice. The way that various churches have used this, you might almost say have weaponized it, in dealing with abuse cases, is only the most obvious example. Forgiveness can simply become a way of legitimizing a fait accompli. For that and for other reasons, the ethics of forgiveness have become one of the real points of tension between traditional Christian ethics and the ethics of the post-Nazi era. The moral lessons we've learnt from the modern age simply don't have much to say about forgiveness. In law, we find it increasingly difficult to cope with amnesties and other acts of indulgence from very long-standing legal tools. The great exception to this rule in modern times is South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was also openly influenced by Christian moral theology in a way that has few international parallels. And of course chaired by a bishop who knew the seriousness, complexity and costs of repentance and forgiveness perhaps as deeply as anyone in modern times. While we might agree that the individual liability, the principle that was established at the Nuremberg trials, is a real moral advance on the collective punishment of the war guilt clause at the end of the First World War, and indeed that there's something magnificent about the way in which the slow, relentless pursuit of Nazi war criminals has continued. The former camp guard Joseph Schutz is on trial now in Germany at the age of 101. For all this, the fact that our new principles make not pursuing the guilty into a source of moral failure, that's a source of problems. I think that sometimes forgiveness can be magnificent too. But ethics aside, merely as a matter of social and political pragmatism, some capacity for forgiveness is essential, especially in an age when the bottomless memory of the internet means that the traditional alternative to forgetting, is becoming increasingly difficult. One risk is that we just all end up throwing stones at one another's glass houses, maybe in the kind of preemptive strikes that are typical of a purity spiral. More likely, and we can see this happening plainly enough already, the impossibility of judicious forgiveness and the ubiquity of some level of guilt creates new kinds of impunity, of the morally debased and despairing, they're all as bad as each other kind. And that dynamic gets manipulated by the powerful to give themselves new kinds of impunity while also wielding an unforgiving public morality to destroy whomsoever they choose. And even the central moral insight of our value system, the focus on human evil, has its problems. You may have seen the comedy sketch by David Mitchell and Robert Webb in which they play two SS officers chatting to each other. And one of them begins to be troubled by the fact that he has skulls on his uniform and begins to wonder what this might mean. He asks his friend, why are our symbols so much more sinister than those of the other side? And eventually he asks him, are we the baddies? Are we the villains? Now, maybe this just shows the intellectual level on which I operate, but I think this is a really profound point. What makes the joke work to us, of course, is that it's self-evidently true to us that they were the villains. It was so obvious. How could they not have realized it at the time? But of course, most of them didn't. Most people in such circumstances don't. If German soldiers were unsettled by their conduct of the war, it didn't lead them to desert their posts. If morale is as bad and desertion as rife amongst Russian troops in Ukraine, as some reports are claiming, I suspect that will not be because they are doubting who is on the side of righteousness. Most people who do evil things, including most actual Nazis, think of themselves as good people and find ways to compartmentalize or justify their actions. Real-life villains believe in themselves and tend not to cackle diabolically. Our modern mythologized versions of the Nazis, our procession of dark lords, are a farcically unrealistic depiction of what actual evil looks like. Most villains do not wear skulls on their uniforms. They are slyer and subtler than that, and often rooted inside us. We can't defeat them by jumping into a Spitfire and blowing things up. And our anti-Nazi values don't give us much wisdom on how to tackle them. One sign of this, not that it's anything particularly new, is the prevalence in popular discourse, not least in newspaper headlines, of the term pure evil. This may sound similar to Hannah Arendt's and Kant's radical evil, but it's not. The reason that evil can be banal is that, at least according to the standard definitions in the Western canon, is that evil is a form of privation. It's a negation, a corruption, a distortion of something that is or once was good. Pure evil makes no sense because evil is by definition impure. Even Nazism had real values buried at its heart. Loyalty, courage, faith to your own kin. I mean, these things are in themselves good things. Without something solid to base itself on, Nazism could never have caused the damage it did. As we were saying earlier, we're maybe readier to recognize that in the case of communism, whose legitimate ethical basis in values like justice for the poor has always been pretty clear. It would never have been able to destroy tens of millions of lives without having real values to call on. But I think the point is much more widely applicable than just those extremes. If evil is not pure, but distorted, corrupted, that means that, at least in principle, it can be overcome. It can even be forgiven. There is something there to rescue. It need not simply be consigned to perdition. I mean, whether or not such a redemption is possible in a particular case. But it also means that it's ubiquitous, that it has many faces. Like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families, its varieties are endless. And like them, it's found in one guise or another behind every door, including our own. It is undoubtedly true that racism, militarism, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and genocide are evil. But they are not the only evils. Knowing that we are against them will not do much to help us tackle some of the other besetting evils of our times, many of which can't be pinned onto a single cackling villain or even a single plausible scapegoat. The entrenchment of economic inequality in our societies, the systematic impoverishment of younger generations. We can find the villains to these stories if we want to, but they're very diffuse. They're barely conscious of the consequences of their actions, and identifying them won't help very much. Or, indeed, the burgeoning climate emergency, which looks set fair to be one of the defining evils of this century. There is plenty of blame to go around. There may come a time for a reckoning. But it seems unlikely that we will succeed in handling what is almost the definitively unifying problem for those of us jammed spikily onto one increasingly uncomfortable planet by trying in Manichaean style to divide ourselves into opposed worlds of good and evil. That's a long-term case, but we've just had a shorter-term worked example of the same problem, as you may have noticed. It was bleakly comic in 2020 to see how some Western countries, Britain above all, tried to understand the COVID-19 crisis through the prism of the Second World War. Blitz spirit was regularly invoked. The Prime Minister made one of his several attempts to model himself after Churchill. The trouble, of course, is that viruses aren't Nazis. This was not an enemy whose morale we could break, or who was trying to break ours. We were fighting the last war. We brought a Spitfire to a germ fight. The liveliness of our wartime rhetoric was, let's say, not matched by the effectiveness of our public health work. So a heroic national effort built Nightingale hospitals that it turned out we didn't quite need. And a new Dunkirk spirit signed up 500,000 volunteers that it turned out we couldn't use. And at least here in Oxford, you produced the new Bletchley Park boffins who cracked the viral code. But meanwhile, none of our myths stopped us emptying hospital wards into care homes, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of people with a speed that made the Nazi program to exterminate the chronically ill look amateurish. More Londoners died of COVID in April 2020 than died in any 1 month of the Blitz. I also think it's significant that our imaginations have latched gratefully onto the possibility that the pandemic started with a leak from a Chinese lab, which would or could mean a human villain somewhere. And of course, the urge to find human villains for natural disasters, especially epidemics, is nothing new. It might even be that this suspicion is correct. It still seems likelier that the culprit was this gentleman, that this is a natural event, and this underlines what may become the decisive weakness of our anti-Nazi value system, which is that it really has nothing to say to environmental issues. Indeed, by giving such a central role to human rights, it builds in an unhelpfully rigid distinction between the human and non-human realms. Frankly, it's pretty inconvenient that Hitler was a vegetarian. Even in the midst of the Ukraine war, it does seem likely that the more major collective challenges we'll face in this century will be triggered by environmental degradation than by genocidal tyrannies. In any case, we'd better have a value system that equips us to deal with both. So that's where I think we are. A value system that's sound as far as it goes, but was never quite up to bearing the weight that's being placed on it, and is starting to crack under the strain. And we're dividing into those who respond by piling more weight onto it in the hope or desperate confidence that it'll settle into a more stable state, not really because there's any reason to think it'll work, as because we urgently want it to and can't think of anything else, and those who are just walking away from the whole edifice. What's to be done? Well, cards on the table. I think the only viable, the only possible way forward is a new ethical synthesis. To deal with the many evils that are coming down the track, we can't abandon our crumbling anti-Nazi values, but we can't depend on them either. We need to rebase them on something more solid, more deeply culturally rooted. And in this cultural context, that means, and I'm phrasing this carefully, cautiously reconnecting with the various ethical and spiritual roots of our cultures. I am not trying to retread T.S. Eliot's implausible and faintly sinister appeal for Christian civilization. Something closer to Roosevelt's Judeo-Christian civilization, or as it would be in this day and age, Abrahamic civilization, or Abrahamic plus. A stable tree can have many roots. Generally, the more the better. Now, I am immediately aware that proposing not merely a truce but a merger during a culture war is likely to be equally unacceptable to both sides. So for this final part of the lecture, I want to make my case to each of the two parties in turn. Why, despite everything, they need each other, or at least need the best of what each other has to give. If you are a secular-minded person and an enthusiast for our anti-Nazi values, what I have to say to you is this. First, recognize how parlous a state your cause is in. The long retreat on many fronts, the shrinking prospect of the battle turning, the increasingly fractious nature of your own side, the systemic weaknesses that I've spent much of this morning describing, something has to change. Now, of course, there's no law of history that says the process of erosion of our common values will continue indefinitely. But if it's going to revert to something recognizably like the old anti-Nazi consensus based around a shared view of evil, I think we know how that might happen, because we know how it happened the first time. It took the deadliest war and the worst genocide in human history, and then 15 or so years to process the shock. I would prefer if we did not have to do that again. I did detect during the COVID crisis, and indeed again at the beginning of the Ukraine war, a certain ghoulish satisfaction from some commentators of the old-fashioned liberal kind. Perhaps this will be enough to shock those frivolous populists out of their delusions and bring them back to the fold. Now, I don't deny that when reality bites, it can change people's minds. But as the anti-vaxxers and Russia apologists and others have shown us all too well over the past few years, reality has to bite pretty hard before people really feel it. At least before we feel it with sufficient shock to reset our prejudices. In every major national or international crisis of this century, from 9/11 onwards, nothing has been more grimly predictable than the rush of voices proclaiming that this, whatever this is, proves that they were right all along, and the dearth of people whose minds have actually been changed. If we're relying on an external shock to reset our values, then we may easily end up with the kind of shock that General Taylor told President Kennedy that he would have to administer. And that's the kind of purifying moral fire that I would rather we did without. I think our religious traditions offer an alternative. You don't need to embrace the metaphysics if you don't want to. That's an argument for another day. And when I say religions, I'm being inclusive. For these purposes, Platonism, Aristotelianism, indeed Confucianism would work just fine if that's the way you're inclined. Never mind the doctrines. Feel the depth, the suppleness, the richness of these systems of values there, the positives as well as the negatives, not the strict system of thou shalt nots that's so easily parodied, but a space within which you can move. I can feel suspicious hackles rising already, so let me be clear what I mean. The ethics of our anti-Nazi era are similar, very similar, to many of the ethical traditions that I'm talking about, but they are not identical, and the differences matter. We all know what the flashpoints are: sexuality, gender, issues around bodily autonomy, the beginning and end of life, a few others. I'm not suggesting that anybody abandon their views on any of these issues, but to find ways of talking rather than shouting about them. Because to understand that people can disagree with you on these points for honest and ethically sound reasons, or that they can do so in nuanced ways, is not to betray your own position. I suggest that recognizing that we live in a world with such a range of nuanced views is better than pretending we don't. Nor does this mean endlessly accepting compromise on issues that should not be compromised, because both religious and secular ethical norms are always in motion. Questions that seem intolerably fraught in one generation, such as divorce or the legitimacy of private education, the heat can fade out of those debates, both in religious and secular ethics. Not to say that everybody comes to agree, but that we find ways of managing and containing our disagreements which are tolerable to the large majority, and that those who continue to press on those matters are aware that in doing so they are a little eccentric. The point about the religious traditions of ethics I'm talking about is that they are endlessly plural and self-critical. Endlessly, but not boundlessly. They are rooted in particularities, in particular teachers, events, traditions, places, institutions. And I think that particularity is one of the greatest problems for modern secularists who might be interested in reaching some sort of accommodation. Because the very core of our post-Nazi values is pluralism and universalism. We are the United Nations. The human rights we declare are universal. To embrace, to give any priority to a particular perspective or tradition is to exclude and discriminate against others. We feel in our bones the logic of Kant's categorical imperative, that ethics only make sense if they are for everyone, everywhere, in every age. Now, it would be a cheap shot to say that we learnt this absolute priority on the plural and the universal from a particular historical event, the war against Nazism. That is a cheap shot, because I think it's fair enough to learn general lessons from a particular event. My reason for being wary of this universalizing tendency, this insistence on absolutes and transcending our own context, is that it is almost comically grandiose. We are deeply contextualized creatures. We're born in a particular place and time, we will die at a particular place and time, and all the limits on our perspective that come with that. If you'll forgive me for introducing a new voice at this late stage in the discussion, I'm going to bring in the great German liberal theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who in his 1799 book on religion was trying to do something a little bit like what I'm trying to do now, to persuade the secular world to take what religion has to offer seriously. And one of the dangers he warns against is of trying to, as we say, set the world to rights, to place yourself imaginatively over the world and decide how it should all be, to implicitly put yourself in an overarching, objective position, what you might call a God's eye view. The kind of view that declares categorical imperatives and makes universal declarations on behalf of the United Nations, transcending all traditions and binding them into something single and deeper. Now, Schleiermacher says it's not wrong to do this, indeed pretty much impossible to think about ethics without doing this, but he warns, beware of the arrogance implicit in it. He says, man has merely stolen the feeling of his infinity and godlikeness, and as an unjust possession, it can't thrive for him if he's not also conscious of his limitedness, the contingency of his whole form, the silent disappearance of his whole existence in the immeasurable. He warns that the great mistake is to place humanity in opposition to the universe and not receive it from the hand of religion as part of the universe and as something holy. Now, we might say spirituality instead of religion if the R word makes you uneasy. But since spirituality that's not anchored in some religious tradition or other is likely to run out on you, I think it comes to much the same thing. Unless we can embrace and come to terms with our specificity, our particularity, then our universal aspirations will run into trouble. Trouble of exactly the kind that I've been talking about. Indeed, there's a very particular and specific historical problem here. A problem which is particularly acute for white people in the post-Christian West. And that is that deep down, many of us have inherited the specific kind of universalizing ambition which comes with viewing yourself as being destined to rule, as carrying the white man's burden. A century ago, the ancestors of many of us here really did believe that the responsibility for the peace and order of the world was their privilege and their duty. In the post-Second World War world, that retreated, but the kind of universal obligation that underlay the rights of the Atlantic Charter, which declares that there should be freedom from want and from fear everywhere in the world, that same sense underlay President Truman's famous Point 4 program in 1949. This is the foundation moment of modern international development, in which he claimed for the United States the power and the right to work towards alleviating suffering and misery across the whole planet. Now, that sense of obligation, that sense that when we hear of suffering anywhere in the world, we feel a pang of responsibility for it. I mean, that is a real and a precious moral achievement. But it's also a claim of power, and it has a post-imperial taint to it. One of the particular and specific characteristics of white Europeans and Americans in this day and age is that we feel ourselves to have universal and general obligations, and so often sit lightly to our own specific identity, partly because we may be aware of the crimes and horrors that have been associated with that political identity, both in the past and in some persistently ugly ways today. But relinquishing that identity to those kinds of people and telling ourselves that we are above such things, enthroned in objective serenity above the firmament, is perhaps unwise and also manifestly untrue. We're all human beings, but we're all specific human beings with specific inheritances. And those inheritances generally have more than enough both to nourish us and to shame us. We don't need to be defined by them, but we'd better not run away from them, because if we do, they will catch us. If instead we allow ourselves to draw on them, we may find that they offer us some of the resources we actually need to navigate this century. Not only a fund of wisdom that we can critically engage with, but the suppleness to forgive and to repent. Some deeply unfashionable but surprisingly useful ethical tricks like patience, humility, self-discipline. And they may even teach us what to love as well as what to hate, what to live for and fight for as well as what to stand against. And if the principled argument doesn't persuade you, there's a practical one, which is that this is going to happen anyway. If you believe that national identities and particularities and traditions and spiritualities that go with them are going to fade away, that we're going to find ourselves at any point living in some universalized metropolitan utopia of the Aldous Huxley or Star Trek kind, then you are living in a particular world indeed. Like it or not, these identities matter profoundly to most of humanity, including, although no doubt in very sophisticated and metropolitan ways, to us. The choices are to get the best we can out of these identities, or to relinquish control over them to the trolls. There's no third option. And now, while you all work out the reasons you disagree, let me turn to the other side of the argument. Why it's not only right, but necessary and in the end unavoidable that the other side in our culture wars, those who've proudly embraced their traditional culture and religious particularities, also need this synthesis to integrate their traditions with the values of the anti-Nazi era. This may seem more improbable, because you will have noticed that the worldwide Christian response to the emerging crisis of confidence in our secular values has on the whole not been constructive and sympathetic. Instead, it's been characterized by smelling secularists' blood in the water. Many of the most open political challengers to our post-Nazi ethical consensus, politicians like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Donald Trump in the United States, or in his own way, Vladimir Putin in Russia, admittedly a different animal from the rest. These men, and many others like them, have characterized their brands of cultural conservatism as Christian. And they've won a lot of support from traditional Christian constituencies in the process. At the risk of falling foul of Godwin's law myself, I do find myself reminded of the Nazi Party's claim in its founding documents in 1920 that it, quote, stands for a positive Christianity. Not that these gentlemen are Nazis, but that they're making the same maneuver. That is, they're using Christianity as an identity, a means of telegraphing their social positioning to potential supporters. For the Nazis, Christian was code for anti-Jewish and anti-communist. Nowadays, it tends to be code for anti-Islamic, anti-academic, anti-globalist, and anti-elitist. It's not really a value system at all in this sense. This is Christianity as tribe, not as movement. It may be loosely connected to the rejection of some aspects of modern secular value systems, LGBTQ issues in particular. But even this doesn't run very deep. These modern cultural Christian movements are, I think we can say, not marked by their ostentatious commitment to traditional Christian sexual ethics. Now, I need to be careful how I comment on this phenomenon, because personally I find most of the features of this assertive cultural Christianity pretty unpleasant. And since I also claim a Christian identity for myself, embarrassing. But I want to try and put that to one side for a minute and examine it in a slightly more hard-headed way, and to argue that for all the apparent surge of energy behind it, this is a movement with no future. It is too plainly a reaction to, a mirror image of, our modern secular values. And while it certainly derives some of its power from the weaknesses of those values, their shallow roots and brittle stridency, it doesn't solve those problems. Quite the opposite. It validates our secular value system. It plays directly into its hands. I mean, be honest. When I said earlier that most real-world villains are subtler and more ambiguous than the caricature of the Dark Lord, Did one of these gentlemen cross your minds? Mr. Putin, Mr. Trump, perhaps? He may have been Voldemort in a clown suit, but in a world where Voldemorts of any kind are thin on the ground, you take what you can get. Secular liberals fell on his election in 2016 almost with gratitude. After years of partial retreats, at last the enemy was out in the open. They may not know how to deal with climate change, with pandemics, with economic injustice, but at least they thought we knew how to deal with him. Resistance. Now we're back in a world where we understand. This is at least the kind of enemy that they've defeated in the past. The gambit that these political movements on the right are making is to attack our modern secular value system, the anti-Nazi system. But unless they've got something actually to put into its place, they must ultimately fail. The rhetoric is of a reversion to Christian values, to Christendom values, as we might say. But all that seems to mean in practice is making some attempt to unlearn the moral lessons of the first half of the 20th century. In the short term, as we all know, the resulting vacuum of values fills itself with corruption and conspiracy mongering. But in the medium term, that is not going to be sustainable. It will fill itself with something else. Ethics abhors a vacuum. Unlikely as it may seem, a set or sets of values for this movement will emerge. And since Christian ethics have pretty deep roots and have successfully weathered some pretty cold winters in the past, I'm reasonably confident that in the long run they will spring up again and displace whatever tangled and poisonous weeds have been sown amongst them in the meantime. Trouble is, as Keynes said, in the long run we're all dead, and I'd like to find grounds for optimism on a slightly shorter timescale. One of the decisive questions of our age is going to be, will these movements reach a set of values that are in constructive dialogue with the secular values of the anti-Nazi era, or will they choose to define themselves against those values? Now, obviously, both of those things are going to happen. But insofar as cultural conservatives do define themselves against our anti-Nazi values, I think that we're making not just a moral but also a political mistake, and that they will fail. If there's one thing that the stories of these politicians has taught us, is that they are providing the secular world with exactly the kind of opposition that it craves. If you are a secularist culture warrior, these are the sorts of Christians you dream of. Ones who will follow this script, who will caricature themselves, allow themselves to be defined by cruelty, thuggishness, and stupidity, and in the end will prove themselves wrong. You want Christians like Mr. Putin in Ukraine, who imagine that you yourself are weak and spineless, but by their very outrages give you a new lease of life. Bloody and frightening as the Ukraine war has been and continues to be, in moral terms, it's positively comforting. We know this story. Cultural conservatives who want to question the values of the anti-Nazi era want to remember that these values were not adopted easily or for trivial reasons. The moral lessons of the 20th century, the lessons that discrimination and cruelty and murder are worse than sexual or doctrinal errors. These lessons were learned the hard way, and the same could be said of the great moral lessons of the 19th century, such as the lesson that slavery is wrong, an idea which was equally new and controversial in its time. A Christianity that tries to refight these battles will be fighting its culture war on the enemy's terms, and there's every reason to think that the outcome will be the same second time around. Whereas a Christianity that has a future is one that embraces what these lessons have taught, and does so not grouchily or hesitantly, but wholeheartedly, and then asks what else it can bring to add some colour to a secular value system that only seems to be able to debate whether issues should be seen in black and white or in shades of grey. A Christianity that provides something to love in addition to all the things that we all know we must hate. Can it be done? I think it is being done. I see considerable hope in Pentecostalism. That is, in Pentecostalism at its best, a phenomenon which offers a genuinely uplifting and enriching spirituality, even if it's not to everybody's taste. politicized Pentecostalism in various parts of the world has attracted a lot of attention in recent years. Not many of those stories are edifying. But the original Pentecostal perspective on politics still endures in a great many countries and churches, which is an inclination to withdraw, to disregard, even to despise politics as a passing worldly business that doesn't really have anything to do with salvation. That is a problematic attitude in many ways. But it has this much going for it. Its profound and surely correct insight that we are at our most human, we come closest in this world to finding whatever we desire in communities, in families, as individuals, not as mass collectives. And so its politics, if it has any, are the politics of liberty and of equality before God. Now, if Pentecostalism isn't to your taste, fair enough. But a Christian movement that has for more than a century been led by and spread among some of the world's poorest and most persecuted people, and which now counts over 500 million followers, has, I think, earned the right to be heard. How can it be done? Well, the most obvious obstacle maybe contains within itself the germ of a solution. Christianity has a very real problem of moral authority in our culture, for the excellent reason that it has been profoundly implicated in abusive and exploitative structures of power for many centuries. Now, it may simply be that Western Christians in this generation need to suck this up and accept that we are still an awful long way from having earned the right to be heard about anything, to go deeper into the wilderness and spend longer there first, another century or two. As I said, the roots run deep. Be that as it may, the way out of this problem, logically the only way out of it, is to exercise another of those old and unfashionable values, a virtue which the secular world struggles with and which, rather more surprisingly, also seem to have slipped off the radar of a large number of Christians. I mean repentance and humility, the very opposite of assertive claims to authority or of moral denunciation. Those are the only means by which Christians in the past have ever truly attained any kind of moral authority. And it also just so happens that those particular moral qualities, repentance, humility, are the ones which both our secular value system and its cultural Christian critics so obviously and damagingly lack. A religion that rediscovers that ethical imperative would already have traveled most of the distance. Whether or not the kind of synthesis that I'm talking about can be done, it must be done. We won't be able to manage the challenges of this century without all the resources of our old values that tell us what's good, as well as the new ones that tell us what's evil. If my principled arguments have left you unmoved, whichever side you're on, here to finish with is a practical one. Whichever side manages this kind of synthesis convincingly, and whichever one manages it first, will find that victory in the culture wars. That is a real chance to determine the values of our culture for a generation or more will be in their grasp. If the anti-Nazi secularists can forge a real and deep alliance which respects and draws on the Christian and Jewish and Islamic and other traditions which actually helped to fight the war against Hitler, then they will renew their own movement and give the lie to the populists claiming to be defending ancient identities against a moralist, secularist wreckers. Or if Christian culture warriors can fully and honestly own the anti-Nazi heritage with all its freedoms and scruples and responsibilities, then they will purge the poison in their own ranks and find that they have the vast majority of our cultures on their side. And truly, I don't believe I care which one of them gets there first. Thank you very much.